Today is November the 20th. Almost 2 years ago to the day, November 22nd, 2023, was Wednesday before Thanksgiving. And on about 5 o'clock that morning on Wednesday before Thanksgiving, the defendant shot and killed his wife, Sheena Levine, and their mom on Easy Road. Now, after he shoots his wife, he doesn't call for help. He doesn't call the police. He doesn't call for an ambulance. He called his children. He called her children. And he said, I'm quoting, "I fucked up." He said it several times. He said, "I effed up," and she grabbed the gun. Well, they're alarmed. Darryl Walker and Darryl Walker Jr., they jump in the car. They drive over to Mom's as fast as they can get there. And when they arrive, the defendant has to unlock the door to let them in. And they find her unconscious, laying in the floor in the hallway, surrounded by blood, naked from the waist down. And he says, "I can't go to jail." He goes, he picks up the gun out of the floor, got in his car and left. Law enforcement arrested him a few days later in Marianna. Now, after his arrest, he came back and he was interviewed by law enforcement. And you'll have the opportunity to hear what he said about that. And he said that they were arguing. He had told her about some infidelity and she was mad. That Ms. Levine went into the room, got a gun, came back out, had a gun. She was upset with him. He said he took the gun, removed the magazine, and was holding it in his hand. The magazine and the gun together in one hand. And while she's mad at him, she was beating on his chest and crying, and he was holding her. He said he was holding her, arms around her. And as she pushes away, his hands are still behind her head, and the gun goes off. And she goes down on the floor. Now, I have to prove to you two things. One, that a crime was committed, and two, that the defendant is the one that committed the crime. This is not an identity case. Who did it is not a question. The issue is whether or not you believe his statement. At the end of the trial, you're going to get instructed on the law. The judge is going to tell you the different crimes and choices and what the elements are. And you'll have to match the evidence to see if I've proven that case to you beyond a reasonable doubt. But I submit to you that the issue you're going to have is whether or not you find his statement credible, especially once you match it up with the physical evidence in the case and the testimony of the witnesses. Because witnesses' testimony and the physical evidence is not consistent with what the defendant says happened. And I submit to you, based on that, you will be able to confidently find him guilty as he's charged. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shea. Mr. Brown, you may give your opening.
Thank you, Your Honor. Court, Ms. Shea.
Morning.
Been a long time since y'all wrote with pencils. Anyway, the state made a lot of conclusory statements just then. They told you that this is what happened. We're here to find out what happened. We're here to find out what they can prove. The way that the state is going to attempt to prove their case to you is through some photographs, through some videos, and as I stated in jury selection on Monday, some of these things are not going to be very pleasant to see. They're not fun to watch. They're devastating. They're sad. But that's not your role here today. Your role is not to succumb to those emotions. Your role is not to be overwhelmed and burdened by the tragedy that occurred almost 2 years ago. Your role is to be critical. Your role is to be attentive. And I trust you will do both of those things. Your role, as I stated, is to be critical, not reactionary. We talked on Monday about some important legal tenets, and I'm going to go over those again briefly this morning before we get going with the evidentiary portion of the trial. We talked about how the burden is solely on the government at rest at this table. We talked about what reasonable doubt is, what it isn't. I'll tell you now, there's three places to find reasonable doubt. It's by the evidence itself, it's by any lack of evidence, which I invite you to pay particular attention to today, and it's by any conflict in evidence. You find reasonable doubt in any of those three places. I'm not going to ask you guys to write anything down. You're going to have full notepads by the time this is all said and done, but if you do remember something from my opening statement, is that if the state fails to prove the things that they have said this morning, you must find Mr. Walker not guilty. Not proven equals not guilty. We talked about why the government has the burden. We talked about our founding, and I talked about history, and I talked about why we have these rights, why we all share these rights, the historical context of what the government can do if gone unchecked. We talked about how you are the check in the checks and balances here this morning. The judge read a statement about Mr. Walker's right to remain silent. And I presume today that he will exercise that fundamental right that we all share as Americans. However, you will hear from Mr. Walker. You'll see a recorded interview that he gave shortly after this incident, and you'll get to hear his words. You'll get to hear his side of the story. You'll get to hear the investigator who says there's two sides and then there's the truth. That's what we're seeking here today. We talked about the presumption of innocence. We talked about how Mr. Walker is clothed in a cloak of innocence and the government must remove that in order to take away his liberty. And we talked about your role. So let's talk about what he's been charged with. He's been charged with second-degree murder with a firearm. As Ms. Shea stated in jury selection, and as I'll reiterate here, the elements are an unlawful killing which has happened. The second is that it was an act eminently dangerous to another and evinces a depraved mind regardless of human life. This is subjective intent. They must prove to you Mr. Walker formulated an idea. They must prove to you that there was a general intent to commit this dangerous act, which I submit to you they will be unable to do, and furthermore, they have to prove that the use of a firearm was consistent with the first three elements. Well, here's something that unfortunately is a fact that everyone agrees on and is uncontroverted this morning. Ms. Sheena Levine is gone. She's gone. There's no changing that. There's no bringing her back. However, the evidence will show that the other elements are not proven. What I anticipate the evidence will show, and I will use that phrase because what I say is not evidence, what Ms. Shea just said is not evidence. You'll find the evidence, you'll see the evidence, you'll come to your own conclusions. But my anticipation of what the evidence will show is that there was an altercation at 12420 Medicine Road that evening. What it will show is that an 8-year marriage and a partnership of almost 20 years that was maybe tumultuous at times came to a devastating conclusion when Ms. Sheena Levine retrieved a firearm during a verbal fight. What the evidence will show is that Ms. Levine sustained a gunshot wound from that firearm, and that wound ultimately caused her death. What the evidence will not show is any intent on the part of Mr. Darryl Walker to effectuate that death. I presume that the state will focus on the actions of Mr. Walker, as they've just indicated they do so, subsequent to this incident in an attempt to shift focus from the fact that there's a drastic lack of evidence to what actually happened that evening. The evidence will also show that after a preliminary investigation, investigators from the Escambia County Sheriff's Office, they do their best to formulate a tragic accident to fit a narrative. That narrative is going to be presented to you today. You'll be presented with photographs, videos, reports. You'll be presented with testimony from multiple people who arrived at the apartment after the gunshot rang out that morning. You'll be presented with a statement from the only person that was present in that apartment when the gunshot rang out, and that's Mr. Darryl Walker. You learn that Mr. Walker admits, as he did to his wife that evening, that he had been stepping out, so to speak, engaging in extramarital affairs, not honoring his vows. You'll learn that Mr. Walker had been sick worried he had transacted some sort of sexually transmitted disease. You'll learn and you'll see on the stove that Miss Levine cooked dinner for the couple. Miss Lyric Walker, who you'll hear from, was invited to that dinner. She didn't make it. You'll see that Miss Levine cooked dinner for the couple and was anticipating engaging in some activity with Mr. Walker that night. You learn that Mr. Walker, concerned for his wife, knew he had no choice but to admit his infidelity and come clean. You'll learn how Miss Levine owned multiple firearms. You'll learn that she knew how to use them. She attended a concealed weapons class. She had 2 firearms that were personally owned by her. You'll learn that Miss Levine, justifiably angry about the revelations, retrieved a gun and confronted Mr. Walker. You'll hear that Mr. Walker tried to leave to remove himself from the situation, was prevented by Miss Levine from doing so. You'll get to watch that statement, you'll get to watch that video, it'll be on that big screen right there, and you'll be able to see the sincerity of Mr. Walker as he recounts trying to leave, as he recounts being prevented from doing so, as he recounts trying to do his best to calm her from her anger, her justifiable anger. You learn that she relinquished the firearm after Mr. Walker spoke to her, he removed the magazine, and they embraced. You'll hear from Mr. Walker how she had another bout of anger, how she lashed out again, how she struck Mr. Walker. And you'll hear from a medical examiner who will attest that Mr. Walker's version of events are in fact congruent with her findings during an autopsy after Miss Levine was tragically struck in the head with a single bullet. The state attorney is going to say, oh, concentrate on Mr. Walker's statements because they don't match up. The state attorney will offer you no explanation of why Mr. Walker supposedly did the thing that he did. You'll hear much more about what happened after, but that evidence will show the actions of a terrified and desperate man. The evidence will show that while Mr. Walker made a series of very unfortunate decisions subsequent to the shooting itself was a tragic accident. I trust that you will do your jobs here this morning. I have no doubt of that. I trust that you'll fulfill your obligations as a critical and crucial check to governmental power. And I trust that after being presented with all the evidence, you will vindicate a grieving husband and return a just verdict of not guilty.